everyone, welcome to Midcast. I'm your host, Manar Adley. Today we're going to be talking about the anti-China lockdown propaganda and COVID economic disaster paving the way for digital currencies and the rise of human capital markets. But what exactly does that mean? Well, today we have a very special guest joining us to discuss all of this and break it down is Raul Diego. He's a Mint Press News staff writer, independent photojournalist, researcher, writer, and documentary filmmaker based in Mexico. And he's one of the most brilliant people that I have come across in the independent media world. So we're very lucky to have him join us today if you haven't been following his work yet. Raul, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Manar. Great to be here.
Of course. So recently, a letter addressed to the FBI entitled "The Chinese Communist Party's Global Lockdown Fraud" has been gaining considerable traction. The letter, signed by a number of prominent individuals, including military commanders and government advisors, essentially suggests that China, in particular, tricked the world into pursuing authoritarian responses to the pandemic. And then, you've spent the last month or so, spent a considerable amount of time writing a series of articles for Mint Press dismantling their argument. What is the overall goal of this letter, do you think?
Well, I don't think that it's a serious request to the FBI. It's more of a propaganda effort to, I think, influence especially the independent media crowd because of how it was disseminated, mostly through Twitter and social media. The letter itself, it's an quote unquote open letter calling for the FBI to investigate what they themselves, the authors themselves, admit there is no evidence for, which is that China deliberately, like you say, tricked the world into establishing these totalitarian lockdown protocols all over the world. The letter goes on to, cite all these supposed instances in which the Xi Jinping, the Chinese premier, personally, in some cases, actually try to foist these measures on the rest of the world, other governments. But upon close examination, there's really nothing there. They're just making this bogus case, trying to pin the blame on the Chinese Communist Party as the to be at fault for what's going on in the world, which is, of course, it's a worldwide coordinated operation that's happening anyway, and it's definitely not an invention of the Communist Party of China.
So talk to me about the authors of this letter and what significant role did they play in writing this?
Well, all of the authors, without exception, espouse libertarian views, which basically are anti-government, pseudo-anti-government really views that essentially are tied to certain economic principles that libertarians hold, which are basically free market economics. It's ideologically driven free market economics. But a lot of the authors have very dubious track records themselves. A lot of them or the main author, the one who's at the top of the list, is a tax lawyer who has worked in firms that have very close ties with Amazon, Google, and all these big tech firms that have very high stakes interest in China itself. There are other personalities, media personalities, who are part of the author list of this propaganda piece. Some of them are in England, the UK, others in Canada. The one that I especially found most intriguing is this a brigadier general of the United States Air Force, who is a serious China hawk and has been writing anti-China books and influencing policy in the United States against China for a long time now. So I mean the purposes of or the purpose of the piece is, I think, just it's very clear given the background of the authors, what their intentions really are, and basically to create this narrative that China is actually behind this coordinated worldwide protocol.
Right, and they've actually argued that the World Health Organization, which is a United Nations, body, is pretty much under the control of Beijing. I mean, can this idea really be sustained?
Absolutely not. I mean, it all hinges on. I mean, according to them, it all hinges on the fact that supposedly Xi Jinping is at some level a personal sponsor of the WHO's Secretary General Director, and that his whole career was patronized by Xi Jinping, and that is supposedly the proof that the WHO, the entire WHO organization, is under the control of the Chinese government. Is in itself absurd, given the extensive ties of the WHO to the entire Western scientific medical establishment, which has been established.
So I want to get to the root of this anti-China sentiment. You've covered in your series that after the Opium Wars of the 19th century, China came under increased Western control. US war planners still to this day talk about the loss of China in 1949, which of course reveals that they saw China as belonging to them until the rise of the Communist Party under Chairman Mao. Is a lot of the frenzied talk about China today based on American worries that they might lose the internet and the digital economy too?
I don't think so. My personal take on the situation, I mean, the establishment of Western domination in China after the Opium Wars was not a fly-by-night operation. It developed over many decades, and even after the communist revolution took over, it really didn't disappear, right? Especially in the medical and scientific establishment, it remained pretty strong, the Western influence, that is. Really, there was only a period of about 6 years, as I write in my second part of my series, really only about 6 years in which you could say perhaps that the Western medical and scientific and academic establishment lost some sort of influence or control over those institutions in China. But it's a drop in the bucket across the decades that they have been major influences and operators in that space in China. And now it's just at this point in 2021, their influence and participation in those sectors in China is more than it's ever been. So, but as far as like fear of the West losing control to China, I don't think that's the case. I think at this point, China is pretty much in league with the top Western interests, and are part of this global campaign to digitize, to make what I'm calling, in this third part that's really coming out today, a digital counterfeit of the world, to produce all kinds of data that is going to inform these, what you announced in the intro as the human capital markets. China's involved, but they're certainly not in control. These are Western financial interests who are driving this, hedge funds. They are the ones who are driving this push.
Right. And can you talk about the Western interests and who is in control of that?
Well, what we have to understand, I think, is the shift that is happening now, where there's a transformation that's going on. It's alternatively referred to as the Great Reset or the Fourth Industrial Revolution, or what have you. And really, it starts to make its moves after the 2008 financial crisis, which in many respects was a controlled demolition of the financial system,
Right.
to usher in what is now unfolding, which is the implementation of human capital markets, which is essentially a data-driven economy, a virtual version of the world where everything is data, people are data. They're trying to create this system where it's just all the surveillance systems that are being deployed all over the world are just data gathering devices to feed the financialization of life, essentially, is what's happening.
So talk to me about your next article, which you wrote about, entitled "For FinTech Magnates, Digital Dollars for the Poor, Exponential Profits for the Rich." And this is very much related to what you're talking about. You wrote that a brave new world of virtual Benjamins will soon become a reality, as Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has been discussing a possible government-backed online currency. Considering that digital currencies are supposed to be decentralized, in the hands of the people, in control of the people. Talk to me about this controversy.
Well, that's the narrative, right? That blockchain is the tool of freedom,
right,
or something like that. But it's exactly the opposite. It's interesting. Before I joined Mint Press, I used to cover the banking consortium SWIFT. I'm sure you know who SWIFT is.
Yes.
A banking consortium that composed of like the 10 largest banks in the world. That they essentially have this system of transactions through the banks. They establish the rules and the protocols for all that. I used to cover their conferences for several years. For like 3 years, I used to go all over the United States recording their panel sessions and all this stuff. And the very last one that I covered was in December, I believe, of 2019. And that was a very interesting one because it was a meeting between all the big commercial banks, the representatives of those banks, and the Fed. And this took place in New York in the basement of a Wells Fargo. And it was a 2-day private meeting where they were supposed to start rolling out the ISO 20022 protocols, which is basically like standard operating procedure protocols for the exchange of electronic data between banks. So it would be the new protocol. And they went through the whole meeting, like all 2 days, and then at the very end. Now remember, this is the end of 2019, right before the whole pandemic starts. At the very end, the Fed comes in. The representative of the New York Fed comes in and puts the kibosh on the whole thing, and they say, well, we're not going to roll out the ISO protocol now, after all. They didn't really give a reason. We're putting a halt on this at the moment, and we'll retake it later on. Now, I'm not sure if they've implemented throughout this whole pandemic year, if they've actually gone through any further inroads on implementing the new protocol. I do know that SWIFT canceled all the forthcoming meetings that they were going to have throughout the year. But, what's going on now, this whole, the new normal that they're trying to implement is part of bringing everything into the digital platforms. And that includes money. Money is they've been trying to, for several years now, to implement these new systems. The banks, they're going to be doing it through blockchain, but in the interim, they're using API technology, which is kind of like a middle of the road technology, a bridge between what is available to people now and, until they build out the blockchain infrastructure, which is coming down the line. And Yellen's, sudden change of, the Fed's heart on cryptocurrencies, suddenly saying, yeah, well, we might look into it, is a pretty strong signal that this is where it's going. And the fact that the fintech sector, which up to now has been limited to basically handling digital money transfers, like, outfits like PayPal and stuff like that, are now themselves applying to become banks themselves. And as I wrote in my article, they're doing so by forming ILC corporations, which are technically industrial loan companies, which are a type of bank that is available to commercial businesses. So a commercial business like Walmart, for instance, who tried to open one, Walmart can open up a bank through these mechanisms, and many of them are established in Utah. That's one of the main centers of where these kind of pseudo banks are opening. And the traditional banking sector is quite worried because they see the writing on the wall. Once private corporations start opening their own banks, well, it's game over for them. There's no reason for that paradigm to continue.
So I have a couple of questions about this, as I'm sure many people who are listening and watching do. I mean, what exactly does this mean for the poor? I mean, you write that these are digital dollars for the poor, exponential profits for the rich, as I mentioned. So how do the poor keep getting poorer through this system?
Well, it's interesting that the rationale that Yellen uses to make her announcement about the digital dollar is that it's going to help solve the situation for millions of unbanked or underbanked people in the United States. Now, these are people who either have no access to banking services or limited access to credit and things like that, which is quite common in the United States. I myself have been, in that bracket, in that demographic when I was living in the United States. And it's tough, you have to rely on things like money orders or friends or whatever to make, your day-to-day transactions, pay rent and your utilities and stuff like that. And there are millions of people like that because, of the unemployment, because of the irregular labor practices all over the United States. And so what a digital dollar allows for is to track, these people, because they're unbanked, they're also in a sense untraceable, right? Their transactions are not completely on the books. So there's, they can do things outside of the purview of federal officials and the IRS and stuff like that. But a digital dollar, it doesn't necessarily solve their situation in terms of their access to credit and stuff like that, because that obviously is up to the credit agencies and their own personal history. But what it does do is that it brings them into a traceable system, so they can track their transactions and bring them into what's coming down the line with the smart contracts and the human capital markets.
Right, and under the guise of COVID, and under the guise of the pandemic, surveillance has expanded exponentially. There's no question about this. I mean, this is just like pure fact, that's taken place now in the last, not just, obviously for the last decade, but it was very much pushed into to fast gear under the pandemic, while people have been living in so much fear of catching COVID or dying from COVID and so forth. And so, talk to me about civil liberty concerns that we're going to be seeing moving forward in terms of surveillance and people's privacy, especially for people like the poor, like you mentioned. All of their transactions are going to be tracked. All of their information is going to be tracked and monitored. What kind of world are we looking at here in the future?
Well, that's the key, right? Because this new so-called moral economy that they're trying to bring online, it all hinges on this principle or theory of how capitalism can now invest in social programs and instead of the state taking care of people who have financial or health problems. It's private equity firms and loose investors who are now going to have the ability to invest in these social programs, looking for a return on their investment, right?
Right.
And for this to be executed, they need the data, right? They need the data of the people going through these harsh conditions in life. The people who are in prison, the people who are in hospitals, who are going through mental health treatments, all these kinds of life problems, right, are now going to be tracked and traced through these surveillance methods that are being deployed all over the world, which is just basically trying to create a feedback loop into the financial markets to create these, so-called smart contracts, which are going to be executed through the blockchain, and are going to be, available for investments and trade along, in the stock market and other related instruments that they'll create around it.
Raul, earlier you mentioned how the blockchain is actually going to be used to trace and track more transactions and people. I've covered blockchain in the past. It's been a while. I am not an expert, okay? I'm going to ask you for, your input on this. From my understanding at that time when I was covering blockchain, the whole point of blockchain was that things are not traceable. They cannot be traced back to the original sender or whatever. Can you explain the dynamics here of how blockchain works and how it will be used to trace? I mean, if you can get down to like kind of the technicality, that would be really helpful for the lay person, okay? That we can all understand.
Well, it's not blockchain per se that is doing the tracing and the tracking, right? What's doing the tracing and the tracking are all the surveillance gadgets that are all around us. All the data gathering tools that they're rolling out, including the upcoming vaccine credential or passport that's in the works and soon to be rolled out all over the world. These are data gathering instruments. The blockchain is only the platform where the smart contracts are executed. Okay. So the traceability of, even though they can, of course, if the people who built the blockchain have the ability to find anything on the blockchain if they desire. I mean, when Bitcoin first came out, there was this whole scandal with the Silk Road website, where this guy was using Bitcoin to sell all kinds of illegal merchandise like drugs and guns and whatever. Mm-hmm. They traced him down, right? So they tracked him down. So I don't believe that, in the end, in the final instance, that blockchain is completely untraceable, but it is not the mechanism by which people are going to be traced and tracked.
I think maybe I misunderstood what you said.
It's the platform where the smart contracts are executed to financialize the data that is collected elsewhere, right?
Right. I understand. Okay, so I'm curious to know what the future of PayPal is going to look like, and WeTransfer and these platforms that are used to transfer funds. How is this new potential digital venture going to differ from the existing tools like PayPal?
Well, I mean, it's hard to paint a complete picture of what is what it's going to look like in the future, but I mean, it's basically what you see now is what you'll probably see on the surface tomorrow, right? It'll just be the underlying structures that are different, and the how all your data is being sold and traded on different marketplaces with or without your knowledge, right? So I mean, as always, the marketing side is going to make sure that everything looks nice and that people think things are great and that it's to their benefit. but the more layers we peel off this onion, the more disturbing and dystopian everything is revealed to be.
I was just about to say, it sounds like a very dystopian, future that we're headed towards, if not already living in. How do you see the new Biden administration in terms of this dystopian future and this relationship that we have with, all this, hawkish talk about China? What do you see that's happening within the Biden administration? Do you think that the Biden administration is going to allow this to flourish, what you're talking about? Or do you see anybody within his administration that are kind of backtracking and saying, this is, not the right way to do things?
Well, I mean, you have to take into consideration several factors, the geopolitical dynamics that, where the United States stands on those geopolitical dynamics. The United States is the military arm of the global financial system in many ways, right? And a large part of their role is to create these conflicts, right? These military engagements around the world, and they are the ones that are leading the way to the so-called conflict with China. The Pentagon is geared up to, they're making these enormous bombs now, which haven't been made in, decades. As as the United States shifted to counterinsurgency operations like in Afghanistan and stuff like that, which have dominated the military space for the last few decades. Now they're shifting back to, these major war footings, that would take on, nation states as opposed to loose groups of insurgents in different countries. And it's all in the service of creating this narrative that we have to confront China, but not only in the military space, in all, spaces like cybersecurity, right. All these things, AI, which, it's these conflicts that allows for, the money to flow into the military industrial complex, to continue the arms trade, to fund all these parts of the war economy that the United States thrives on, right?
Absolutely, and that's exactly what this country thrives on, is the war economy. The United States is the largest empire the world has ever seen, and for our media to continuously demonize China the way that it does, it's almost as if even the way that they do it is like projection, it's always projection. And, China is a major human rights abuser. China is a surveillance state, an authoritarian state, this, that. It's like they're describing all of the things that we are here in the United States. And it's pretty disturbing, because a lot of people in this country who consume mainstream corporate media, they take this information and it settles into their subconscious, and they slowly but surely believe that China is the enemy, when in reality, it is the financial system. It is the war economy that is the enemy, the military industrial complex that is just ravaging the world. And not just the world, but right here at home, ravaging, communities of color, indigenous communities, contaminating our water, our earth, and just completely destroying this planet. And I don't mean to go on a tangent, but that's really who the true enemy is. If people turned to independent media and followed work like yours, Raul, they would have a better idea of what was happening in the world around them. Now, talk to me about your part 3. I know that hasn't come out yet. It's going to be published, within the next day or so. Talk to me what we have to expect in your part 3.
Well, in part 3, I go basically to the ultimate consequences of what is shaping up in terms of the conflict that they're trying to create with China. Because one of the results of any conflict is the generation of more refugees, more people in poverty, more people with problems, right? which
Yeah.
this new human capital markets model is designed to exploit. So it has many different angles that people need to pay attention to. And what I deal with in my third part of the series is how they're using they're using the conflict with China and the virus, the pandemic, to usher in what they really need to scale up the human capital markets model, which is the genomic data of human people, right? Of humanity, human people, of all of us, right? And they're going to do this through vaccine passports, which makes it easy to collect and track the data, the health data of billions of people, essentially, which is what they need to scale up their models, which is the only way they're going to make it profitable. Because at this point, it's not yet a viable model. So this is something that I think we have to understand, is that they're not quite yet at the point where they can do this, right? We still have time to resist it. And what, at the point that they are now is that they're trying to amass as much data as possible, which they do not yet have, right? That's why they're rolling out all these surveillance mechanisms and doing everything they can to establish the Internet of Things, Internet of Bodies, etc., to accumulate the data to build up their human capital market system. So, in part 3, I expose all of this, but just in an effort to show that they're still not where they need to be, and that we still have the power to roll this back. If we realize what they're trying to do and stop it in its tracks, which I think we can.
Well, and what's so interesting about everything you just described is that we can't have discourse about this issue online anymore. Like, the conversation is so polarized. Like, people are on opposite ends of the spectrum, that if you take like a middle approach where you're like, okay, I'm concerned about COVID, I'm concerned about, maybe I want to get a vaccine, but I want to learn more, or whatever. If you take a middle approach to try to understand what's happening, and you show concern for like the surveillance state, you show concern that, I don't want my information everywhere, you're all of a sudden labeled as like a conspiracy theorist. You're all of a sudden like attacked from even both ends of the spectrum. So what do you think is happening to the discourse online in terms of this new age that we're living in terms of COVID? I mean, you can't even have like a logical conversation anymore about anything, it seems like. And it seems like people are being pitted against each other, when in reality, the real, our focus should really be the powers that be, like you mentioned, who are creating this whole entire like digitalized system to track us. But instead, we're fighting each other about like, the ingredients of the vaccine, or, are you anti-vax or pro-vax? Like, it's so ridiculous. Like, you can't even just be in the middle anymore.
Well, that's always been the strategy, right?
Right.
The divide and conquer. And what happened, what they do is that they put out these, bits and pieces of the problem, right? Like you said, like the ingredients of the vaccine, or like one that's going on right now, which is that a famous British journalist took the vaccine, who had previously been against the vaccine, right? And all these, these side issues that people get into it online and stuff. Meanwhile, they're losing the plot, right? They're losing focus on the fact that the only thing that's happening is that they're trying to collect our data one way or another. So as long as we keep on, bickering about these different little things, they're going to, even the deplatforming, in many ways, it's a distraction. They're trying to distract people from focusing on the real thing. Like when they deplatform a marginal, independent voice, right? They just do it to get a rise out of, certain people, and start, get them bickering about things that in the end are not really going to matter, right?
Exactly.
So it's certainly a strategy, right? It's not uh, gratuitous. They're doing it for a reason, and people just need to learn. They need to figure out exactly what is going on, why they're doing it, so that they can focus on the right things and not, be distracted by nonsense.
Absolutely. And the problem too, Raul, and we talk about this often, is that, even so-called like leftist media or independent media or alternative media, they're not even going far enough in really, putting the pieces of the puzzle together to talk about surveillance. I mean, I believe Mint Press is like one of the, not one of the, we are one of the only within our circle of independent media outlets that actually do cover surveillance and civil liberties. And there just needs to be more, but organizations like The Intercept, for example, which covered the Snowden files and covered the National Security Agency and this massive surveillance system, are barely touching the surface on the rise of this new digitalized age that we're living in. And so that's really why people have to turn to independent media and really know the media that they're turning to. We can't rely on mainstream media, or what I like to call like hipster leftist hipster propaganda outlets like Vice News or like the Huffington Post or something like that. So we have to really look to independent media for that. And of course, we don't always have the answers and know everything, but we do our due diligence to do the research and work with really bright, smart people like yourself who can bring this information to the table. So if you guys have not been following Raul's work, he's a staff writer at Mint Press News. He's done extensive coverage, covering the surveillance state for Mint Press. Make sure to check his work out on our website. Thank you so much, Raul, for joining us today.
Thank you, Manar.